He had been dead for 3 years. At least, that's what everyone believed, and Wyatt Ashcroft had half believed it himself, lying broken in a frozen mountain pass with 2 shattered ribs and nothing but elk hide between his skin and the killing cold. But dead men don't drag themselves out of the wilderness. Dead men don't limp 400 miles south on a leg that never healed right. And dead men sure don't stand at the edge of their own property, staring at smoke rising from a chimney in a house that should have been swallowed by the bank 2 years ago. Yet here he stood, breathing, bleeding a little through the bandage on his side, and completely unprepared for the woman who was about to open that door and ask him who the hell he thought he was. If you've ever wondered whether a single forgotten act of kindness can come back and save your life years later, stay with me to the end of this story. Like this video, and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The first thing Wyatt noticed was the fence line. It ran straight and tight along the eastern pasture. Cedar posts driven clean into the hard ground, wire strung without a sag in it. He'd built that fence himself in the spring of '71, and by the time he'd left for the northern drive in the fall of '72, 2 full sections had rotted out and collapsed. He told himself he'd fix it when he got back. He hadn't gotten back. Not for a long time. He stood at the property boundary for a solid minute, just looking. The corrals held maybe 40 head of cattle. Not fat, exactly, but healthy, winter-fed. The barn roof had been patched, dark new timber against weathered gray. The kitchen garden was put to bed for the season. The soil turned and mounded the way Margaret used to do it, though he had to stop himself from thinking too much about that, because thinking about Margaret still had a way of dropping him to his knees if he wasn't careful. He walked up the path toward the house. His left leg pulled with every step, a deep grinding ache that no amount of walking had ever fully worked out. The doctor in Laramie, if you could call him that, a barber who'd set bones on the side, had told him the leg would always be like this now. Something to do with the way the bone had knit wrong in the cold before anyone found him. Wyatt had learned to stop noticing it most of the time. He noticed it now, walking up his own front path, because every step felt like it was asking him whether he was sure about this. He wasn't sure about anything. The smoke from the chimney meant a fire inside, which meant wood that someone had cut and stacked and burned, which meant a person living in his house. He tried to prepare himself for what that might mean. The bank had a right to the property if the debt went unpaid, and the debt had almost certainly gone unpaid, because Wyatt had been missing and presumed dead, and there was no one left to pay it. So whoever was in there had either bought the place legal or was squatting, and either way it was going to be a conversation he didn't much want to have. He knocked on his own front door. Nothing for a moment. Then footsteps, not heavy, but deliberate, and the door pulled open. The woman standing in the doorway was somewhere in her mid-40s, with dark hair shot through with gray, pulled back from a face that had been weathered by outdoor work, not age. She was wearing a wool work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows despite the November chill, and she held a cast-iron ladle in one hand like she'd been interrupted mid-stir. She looked at Wyatt the way you look at someone who's shown up where they have no obvious reason to be, not frightened, just assessing. "Can I help you?" she said. "This is my ranch," Wyatt said. The ladle stopped moving. Something shifted in her face. Not quite fear, not quite recognition. She looked him over slowly, the way you look at something when you're deciding whether it's real. "What did you say your name was?" "I didn't," he said. "Wyatt Ashcroft." The color went out of her face so fast he thought she might actually faint, and he took a half step forward without thinking about it. She didn't faint. She put one hand flat against the doorframe and stood there for a second looking at him like he was something that had crawled out of a nightmare or a dream. He couldn't tell which. "That's not possible," she said, and her voice had gone quiet in a way that meant she wasn't really talking to him. "Everyone said—" She stopped, swallowed. "Everyone said you were dead." "I know what everyone said." She looked at him for another long moment. Then she stepped back from the doorway. "You better come in." Her name was Evelyn Mercer, and she made coffee without asking if he wanted any, which he appreciated because he would have said no out of politeness, and he desperately needed it. She set a cup in front of him at the kitchen table. His kitchen table, his chairs, though she'd sanded and re-oiled the wood at some point, which he noticed and said nothing about, and sat down across from him with her own cup and looked at him steadily. "How long?" she asked. Since? Since you've been back. Since you made it out of wherever you were. I made it to Laramie about 6 weeks ago, he said. Took me a while after that before I could travel. The leg. She glanced down at his leg and then back up at his face. The drive, she said. The northern drive in the fall of '72. That's when they said, avalanche, Wyatt said. Above the Sweetwater. I was scouting ahead of the herd. The other 2 men with me didn't make it. He picked up the coffee cup and held it in both hands just for the warmth. I made it to a trapper's cabin. I don't remember much of the first month. The trapper he was decent, kept me alive. But I couldn't travel, not in winter, not with the leg like it was. And by the time spring came and I could move, he stopped. The drive was gone. The cattle were gone. I had no money, no horse, nothing. It took me 2 more years to work my way back south with enough to get home. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She turned her coffee cup in a slow circle on the table. When we heard, she said, and the we was careful, restrained, like she was being precise about something. When the men from the drive came back and said you were gone, the bank sent a notice. 6 weeks. That's what they gave before they intended to move on the property. I know what the bank does, Wyatt said. I've been dealing with that bank for 11 years. Then you know they don't wait. I know. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite name. So when you didn't come back after 6 weeks, they didn't seize it, because the debt was paid. He set down the cup. By who? She held his gaze. By me. The kitchen was quiet except for the fire popping in the stove. Outside, something, a horse probably, shifted weight in the corral and blew out a breath that fogged in the cold air. Why? Wyatt said. It came out flat, not quite a question. Because I owed you, Evelyn said. You don't know me. No, she said. I didn't, but I knew what you did. Yet, she told it plain, without much decoration, which was the only way he could have heard it right then. 4 years before, she had been living in a town called Hatcher's Creek, about 60 miles northeast, with her husband Thomas and their 2 daughters. Thomas had been a decent man with a talent for making poor financial decisions, and the worst of those decisions, a failed investment in a mining venture that had turned out to be more or less imaginary, had left them with a debt to a local creditor that they had no way to pay. Thomas had died of a fever the following winter, which Evelyn would have called the cruelest timing imaginable, except that timing had nothing to do with it and never did. She was left with 2 daughters, a house she didn't own, and a debt that a man named Carlisle Briggs intended to collect by the 1st of the month. I had nothing, Evelyn said. I'd sold everything I could sell. I'd asked everyone I could ask. I had maybe a third of what I owed and no way to get the rest. What happened next she'd had to piece together later, from the landlord and from Briggs's clerk, because she hadn't witnessed it herself. A man she didn't know had walked into Carlisle Briggs's office and paid the remainder of her debt in full. Cash. Asked for a receipt made out in her name, told Briggs not to mention his own name to her, because he didn't want thanks for it. Then he left town before she knew any of it had happened. I found out the next morning when Briggs sent his clerk over, Evelyn said. The clerk wouldn't tell me who'd done it. Briggs honored the request and kept the name to himself. I spent 3 weeks trying to figure out who it was before I finally let it go. She turned the cup again. About a year later, I heard it from someone passing through, a drover who'd been in Briggs's office the same day. He recognized the name when I described what had happened and where. Wyatt Ashcroft, Wyatt said. Wyatt Ashcroft, she said. He didn't remember it. He sat there in his own kitchen looking across the table at this woman and tried to find it. A trip to Hatcher's Creek, a dead office, some widow's bill he'd paid. And there was nothing. Not a fragment. He'd passed through a lot of towns in those years, done a few things he was proud of and a long list he wasn't. And if he'd done this particular thing, he'd done it the way he apparently asked it to be done, without leaving a mark on himself. You paid my debt, he said. I don't mean to say it like that. You don't remember, Evelyn said. It wasn't an accusation. It was just a statement of something she'd clearly already made her peace with. No, he said. She nodded slowly. I figured you might not. A man who asks for the receipt to be made out in her name and says, don't tell her who did it. That's not a man who's keeping a tally. Wyatt looked down at his hands on the table. How much was the debt? Enough, Evelyn said. More than I'll tell you. He looked back up at her. "When I heard you were dead," she said, "and I heard the bank was going to take this place, I thought about what you'd done. What you'd done for a woman you'd never met, who couldn't pay you back, in a town you were just passing through." She stopped for a second. "I thought about your wife. I'd heard about her, heard she was buried on the property, and I thought about what it would mean for a man's home to disappear while his name was on a stone somewhere in the ground underneath it." She shook her head. "I couldn't leave it." "So you paid the debt?" "I paid what was left of it. It wasn't as much as what you'd paid for me, but I didn't have what you'd had." She said it without apology. "I moved in because an empty property falls apart. Someone needed to be here. For 2 years. For 2 years," she said. Sick. He slept in the barn that first night because it didn't feel right to take the house yet, and he didn't want to think too hard about why. He lay on his back in the hay and stared at the underside of the roof, the new board she'd laid up in the corner where the old ones had gone rotten, and thought about a woman he didn't remember helping, carrying a debt across years and miles and grief to pay it back to a dead man's empty house. He thought about Margaret, too. He couldn't not. Margaret, who had built this place with him from 3 fence posts and a borrowed plow, who had put that garden in and kept it year after year, who had laughed at him in that specific way she had when he said something that was meant to be serious but came out sideways. Margaret, who had died of pneumonia in the winter of '71 while he was hauling timber in the northern stands and didn't get back in time. He'd left on the cattle drive a year later because staying had become a particular kind of unbearable. He hadn't expected to come back. And yet, he was here. The house was standing. The garden was turned and waiting for spring. Someone had weeded around the grave marker. He'd seen it from a distance when he came up the path, the little plot under the 2 cottonwoods, and the ground around it was clean, no wild grass creeping in. He didn't know what to do with any of it. In the morning, Evelyn was already up and had porridge on when he came in through the back door. She handed him a bowl without ceremony, and they ate standing up at the counter because that seemed to be how she did it. Outside, the sky was the flat white gray of a November morning with something cold behind it. "The cattle," he said. "Where'd they come from?" "I started with 6, she said. "Bought them with what I had left after the debt. Built from there." She drank her coffee. "The bull's not mine. He belongs to a man named Hendricks, about 8 miles east. I run him on shares." "Smart." "It was necessary," she said, which wasn't quite the same thing. He looked out the window at the corrals. "What are your plans?" She was quiet for a moment. "I've been waiting to see what yours were." He turned to look at her. She met his eyes evenly. She had a way of doing that, not aggressive, not cold, just level, like she wasn't going to look away first and wasn't making a point of not looking away. "You've been running this ranch for 2 years, he said. "Keeping it," she said. "There's a difference." "Not from where I'm standing." She set her cup on the counter. "Wyatt, this is your land, your house, your wife's grave in that yard. I came here to pay a debt, and the debt is paid now that you're standing here alive. I'm not—" She stopped. "I'm not trying to stake a claim to something that isn't mine. And if I don't want you to leave?" She looked at him, a long, careful look. "Then say that plainly." He turned back to the window. The corrals, the barn he'd built with Thomas Gruber and 2 other men in the summer of '68, the fence line running straight and tight where it had once sagged and fallen. "I've been gone 3 years, he said. I came back to a house that should have been a ruin and a grave that someone weeded and cattle in a corral I didn't buy." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know how to run this place alone anymore. I'm not sure I ever did, not really." "You ran it for years." "I ran it with Margaret," he said. "That's different." The words sat in the kitchen air between them. Evelyn didn't say anything, which he appreciated. Some people rushed in to fill silence like that, and he'd never had patience for it. "I'm not asking you to stay because I need a hand," he said. "I'm asking you to stay because you built something here, and I don't think it's fair to walk away from something you built." She was quiet for a long moment, looking at the side of his face. "That's not the same as a partnership," she said finally. "No," he said, "but it's where I'm starting." He looked at her. "You got objections to where I'm starting?" Something shifted in her face, not quite a smile, but something that lived in the same neighborhood. "I have objections to most things," she said. "That specific one I'll consider." He nodded and turned back to the window, and they stood there in the kitchen of his dead wife's house and watched the first thin snow of the season start to come down over the mountains to the north, covering everything that had happened there, making the land look clean and new and not at all like a place where anyone had ever suffered anything. It looked, for just that moment, like something that could still be saved. The snow that started on Wyatt's first morning back didn't amount to much, 2 inches by noon, gone by the following afternoon, leaving the ground dark and wet and the air smelling like cold iron. But it was enough to make clear that winter wasn't waiting on anyone's feelings about it, and that two people who had just agreed to something neither could fully name were going to have to figure out the practical shape of that agreement before the real cold came down from the north. They started with the cattle, not because it was the most urgent thing, and not because either of them had decided to begin there. It was just that Wyatt walked out to the corrals the second morning to have a look at the herd, and Evelyn came out 20 minutes later because the Hendricks bull had been off his feed for 2 days, and she wanted eyes on him. And they ended up standing on the same side of the fence, looking at the same animal without either of them having planned it that way. "He's not sick," Wyatt said, watching the bull move along the fence line. "I know he's not sick," Evelyn said. "He does this every November. Hendricks warned me the first year. Stressed by the cold. Stressed by something." She crossed her arms over her chest. "He'll come around when the real winter settles in. It's this in-between weather he doesn't like." Wyatt watched the animal for another minute. He had a good eye for cattle. Margaret used to say it was the one thing he was genuinely suited for, which she'd meant as a compliment, even though it didn't always land that way. The bull's coat was thick, his eyes clear. Whatever was bothering him wasn't physical. "You send word to Hendricks about the share arrangement?" Wyatt asked. "Not yet," she said. "I didn't know what to tell him." "Tell him the owner came back and the arrangement stands." She glanced at him. "Does it?" "You've been running him on shares for 2 years and he's producing. Why would I change it?" "Because it's your bull now. Or your arrangement, anyway. You might want different terms." "Do you want different terms?" She looked back at the bull. "I want whatever makes the operation work." He nodded. That was a reasonable answer. It was also, he was starting to understand, very much how Evelyn Mercer talked. Practical on the surface, something more careful underneath. He sent a letter to Hendricks that afternoon. Evelyn told him what the existing terms were without him having to ask twice, which he appreciated. She kept the ranch accounts in a ledger she'd bought herself, black-covered with her name on the inside front page in neat handwriting that then gave way to columns of figures that were dense and precise and told the story of 2 years' worth of careful, grinding work. She set it on the kitchen table in front of him that evening without comment, and he spent an hour going through it while she mended a split in the barn door hinge by lamplight. When he came to the page where she'd recorded paying off the bank debt, he stopped. He looked at the number for a long time. Then he turned the page. "You're short," he said. "I know," she said without looking up from the hinge. "Not badly, but you've been running thin margins." "Every frontier operation runs thin margins," she said. "The ones that pretend otherwise are lying to themselves." That was true. He closed the ledger. "We'll need to move at least 15 head in the spring to shore up the position. Earlier if we can get to a buyer before the main market rush." She set down the hinge and looked at him. "You want to sell 15? What would you do?" She thought about it. He could see her actually thinking, not performing consideration, but genuinely working through it. "I'd sell 10. Keep 5 of the better heifers back for breeding. If we push 15 now, we slow the herd growth and we're back in the same position next year." He considered that. "You'd need the spring calves to make up the difference." "That's the bet," she said. "But the herd's in good shape. The calves should be strong." "If the winter doesn't hit too hard." "If the winter doesn't hit too hard," she agreed. He picked up the ledger again and made a note in the margin. She watched him do it and said nothing about whose ledger it technically was, which he noticed and also said nothing about. The thing nobody told you about coming back from being dead, not that anyone had much experience to draw from, was that the living hadn't stopped while you were gone, which was obvious when you thought about it, but obvious things had a way of not landing until they landed on you directly. The neighbors came by in the first 2 weeks in ones and twos, drawn partly by the news that Wyatt Ashcroft was somehow breathing, and partly, he suspected, by curiosity about the situation with Evelyn. Word traveled fast on the frontier, and it didn't always travel accurately, and he'd heard enough versions of his own near-death story in Laramie to know that the truth of a thing and the story people told about it could end up miles apart. First to come was a man named Dolph Carver, who ran the spread to the south and who had been on nodding terms with Wyatt for a decade without ever becoming what you'd call close. Carver shook Wyatt's hand at the door with the expression of a man who'd made peace with something and was now being asked to unmake it. "We had a gathering," Carver said. "For you. Not a funeral exactly, but—" He cleared his throat. "The Hendricks boys said some words." "That's decent of them," Wyatt said. "It was in the spring of '73. Carver looked past Wyatt's shoulder into the house, trying not to look like he was looking. "So this woman, she just moved in?" "Evelyn Mercer," Wyatt said. "She's a partner in the operation." Something moved across Carver's face. A brief rearrangement of opinions happening in real time. A partner. That's the word I used. Carver cleared his throat again. He was a man who communicated a lot through throat clearing. "I see. Well, good to have you back, Ashcroft." He paused. "We thought the bank had taken the place." "They didn't," Wyatt said. Carver nodded slowly. He clearly wanted to ask more and had done the calculation on whether asking more would serve him and come up short. "Good to have you back," he said again, and left. Evelyn appeared in the kitchen doorway behind Wyatt. "How many more of those do you have coming?" "Probably 6 or 7, Wyatt said. "They're going to talk." "They're already talking," he said. "Let them. Talking doesn't affect the cattle prices." She was quiet for a moment. "It might affect other things." He turned to look at her. She was leaning against the door frame with her arms crossed, not troubled exactly, but thinking about something. "You worried about your reputation?" he asked. It wasn't a dismissal. It was a genuine question. "I'm worried about yours," she said. "I know what mine is. A widow woman living on a dead man's property doesn't have a reputation that needs protecting. She's already made her choices in their eyes. And what do their eyes say about me? That you came back to find a woman living in your house and made her a partner instead of sending her on." She met his eyes. "Some of them will think it's righteous. Some of them will think something else. And you want me to care about that." "I want you to know about it," she said. "What you do with it is your business." He thought about that for a moment. Then, "Did it bother you, while I was gone and it was just you here? What people thought?" She considered the question with that same genuine attention she gave to the cattle decisions, the ledger numbers. "The first winter, yes," she said. "After that I got busy enough that I stopped having time to care, and then I didn't care much anymore." She paused. "Caring what people think is a luxury for people who have enough surplus to afford it. I didn't have surplus." He turned back toward the window. "I don't imagine I'll have much surplus either," he said. "So we'll just have to struggle on without caring." She made a small sound that might have been a laugh, though it happened too fast to be sure. Then she went back into the kitchen and the conversation was over. Evelyn's daughters came at the end of November. He'd known they existed. She'd mentioned them in passing. 2 girls she'd placed with her sister's family in Cheyenne when she made the decision to come to the ranch. Because there was no school nearby, and she couldn't ask children to winter in a broken-down homestead she wasn't sure could be saved. But knowing they existed and having them arrive in a hired wagon with their coats buttoned wrong and their chins set against the cold were different things. Clara was 14 and had her mother's level eyes and an opinion about everything she'd share with you whether or not you'd asked for it. Nora was 11 and quieter in a way that was watchful rather than shy. She missed nothing, but she decided for herself what to do with what she saw. Wyatt met them in the yard when the wagon came up the road, because he happened to be coming out of the barn, and there wasn't time to go back in and pretend he hadn't seen them. Evelyn came out of the house and went straight to them, and there was a brief intense moment of coats and arms and a quietly murmured exchange between her and Clara that Wyatt couldn't hear and didn't try to. Then Evelyn turned and said, "Clara, Nora, this is Wyatt Ashcroft. This is his ranch." Clara looked at him with an expression that said she was deciding something. "Mama wrote about you," she said. "Said you came back from the dead." "That's probably putting it stronger than it deserves," Wyatt said. "She said everyone thought you were dead and you walked back in." "Something like that. And you let her stay." "Clara," Evelyn said quietly. "I'm just saying what she wrote." But Clara softened it a little, something around the eyes changing. "Thank you," she said to Wyatt, and said it like she meant it. Nora, beside her sister, was looking not at Wyatt but past him at the house, taking it in, the mended porch rail, the clean windows, the smoke from the chimney. Then she looked at Wyatt. "Is that your wife's grave?" she asked. "Under the cottonwoods?" "Nora," Evelyn said, and this time there was more warning in it. "It's all right," Wyatt said. He looked at Nora. "Yes, her name was Margaret." Nora considered this. "Mama weeded around it every week," she said, "even in October when it was cold." "I saw that," he said. Something in the girl's face settled, like she'd asked the question she needed to ask and gotten back an answer that satisfied her, and now they could move forward. She picked up her bag from beside the wagon wheel and looked at the house again. "Is there room?" she asked her mother. "There's room," Evelyn said, and that, apparently, was that. What surprised Wyatt most, and it surprised him enough that he spent some time turning it over to make sure he wasn't misreading it, was how little it bothered him to have people in the house again. He'd expected to feel invaded. He'd expected the noise of it, the rearrangement of space, the having to account for other people's presence, to sit wrong with him the way most things sat wrong with him now. The years in the mountains and the slow, hard road back had sandpapered him down to something not quite raw, but close to it. He startled at things he hadn't used to startle at, and he had a low tolerance for people making demands on his attention that he hadn't chosen to give. But the girls were not what he'd expected. Clara, for all her directness, did not require managing. She had opinions, and she stated them, and then she went off and did whatever came next without needing Wyatt to validate the opinions or argue with them. Nora moved through the house like weather, present, observable, and not asking anything of you. They did their chores without being told twice, fought with each other over small things in the particular efficient way of sisters who had been fighting with each other their whole lives, and left Wyatt's silences mostly alone. He found, to his own discomfort, that the house felt less like a place where things had ended and more like a place where things were happening. He didn't know what to do with that. The trouble arrived in December with the cold and a man named Pierce Dalloway. Dalloway ran the Consolidated Territorial Bank's regional office out of a town called Grassmere, 20 miles east. He was a man in his early 50s who wore his authority the way some men wore good boots, conspicuously and with the air of someone who wanted you to notice the quality. He arrived at the ranch on a gray Tuesday morning in a buggy that was too fine for the road conditions, and he knocked on the door with 3 knocks that each landed like he expected them to be answered immediately. Wyatt answered it himself. "Mr. Ashcroft," Dalloway said, and his tone managed to communicate both surprise and dissatisfaction in the same 2 words. "I wasn't informed you'd returned." "I didn't inform anyone," Wyatt said. "What can I do for you?" Dalloway had papers. Of course he had papers. Men like Dalloway always had papers, kept in a leather case with brass clasps that he opened with practiced efficiency on Wyatt's kitchen table. The papers were about the original debt on the property, which Wyatt understood had been paid. Dalloway's position was somewhat more complicated than that. "The payment made in the spring of 1873, Dalloway said, arranging papers in a row like he was laying out a hand of cards, was made by a third party. He glanced at his notes, though Wyatt suspected he didn't actually need to glance. "An Evelyn Mercer. At the time of payment, you were legally deceased by declaration of the Territorial Court. That declaration was filed in October of 1872. Evelyn had come in from the back of the house and was standing in the kitchen doorway. Dalloway glanced at her with the particular kind of acknowledgement that isn't quite acknowledgement. "I'm not legally deceased," Wyatt said. "I'm standing in front of you." "Indeed, and that is in some respects the complication." Dalloway straightened one of his papers. "When a debt is paid by a third party on behalf of a legally deceased individual, and the property is subsequently maintained and improved by that same third party, the question of ownership becomes, 'The property is mine,'" Wyatt said. "Under the original deed, yes. However, there isn't a however," Wyatt said. "I own the property. I'm alive. The debt was paid. What else are we talking about?" Dalloway paused. Something shifted behind his eyes, a small recalibration. "There's also the matter of the declaration of death, which must be formally reversed through the Territorial Court. Until that reversal is filed and approved, your legal standing with respect to the property is, Complicated, Evelyn said from the doorway. Both men looked at her. She came the rest of the way into the kitchen, pulling her sleeves down and buttoning the cuffs. I've been expecting something like this, she said, and she wasn't talking to Dalloway. She was talking to Wyatt. The declaration. I looked into it when I made the payment. They filed it in Grasmere. Why didn't you say something? Wyatt said. I was waiting to see what shape it came in, she said. She looked at Dalloway now, level and unimpressed. What exactly is the bank's position, Mr. Dalloway? Because the roundabout way you're going at it suggests you know the position is thin. Dalloway's jaw moved slightly. The bank's position is simply that. Until the legal status of the property is formally clarified, it would be prudent for all parties to To do what? Evelyn said. Stop improving it? Stop running cattle on it? Stop building it into something worth something, so that if the bank did somehow end up with a claim, that claim would be more valuable? The silence after that was not comfortable. Dalloway touched the edge of one of his papers. We're not claiming the property, he said carefully. Then what are you doing here? Wyatt asked. Dalloway gathered his papers with a measured deliberateness. I came to inform you of the legal situation, as a courtesy. He stood. I'd advise you to file the reversal of declaration as soon as possible. There are certain parties who might, given a window of legal ambiguity, attempt to establish competing interests. What parties? Wyatt said. Dalloway closed his leather case. I'm not in a position to speculate. He said it the way people say things when they're in a very clear position to speculate, but have decided not to. Good day, Mr. Ashcroft. Wyatt walked him to the door and watched the fine buggy turn around in the yard and go back down the road, wheels cutting through the thin crust of ice on the frozen mud. Behind him, Evelyn said, He knows something. I know, Wyatt said. The competing interests. That's not a guess. He's been talking to someone. Or someone's been talking to him. Wyatt turned away from the door. What does it take to reverse the declaration? The legal process. You need 2 witnesses who can confirm your identity and attest that you're alive. You file in the territorial court in Grasmere. Usually takes 4 to 6 weeks for it to be processed and recorded. She paused. I already asked. 8 months ago, when I was thinking about what would happen if you turned up. He looked at her. You were thinking about that? I thought about it occasionally, she said, without particular expression. What it would mean. Whether you might still be out there. A short pause. Whether someone might come looking to take advantage of the window before you did. He stood there in the doorway of his own kitchen and looked at this woman who had paid his debt and kept his house and weeded his dead wife's grave and quietly investigated the legal mechanisms for reversing his death certificate on the chance he might still be breathing somewhere out in the territory. And he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not quite gratitude, which was too small a word for it, and not quite the other thing, which he wasn't ready to name yet. Just the plain hard weight of realizing that someone had thought carefully about your life and your chances, when you hadn't been thinking about it yourself. Who are these competing interests? He said. That, Evelyn said, is what we need to find out. She went to the window and looked out at the gray December sky, at the corrals and the fence line and the cottonwood standing bare over the grave in the corner of the yard. Her face had that focused quality it got when she was working through something, not anxious, just working. There's a man, she said. I've heard his name twice in the past 6 months from different people. Caldwell. He's been buying up disputed properties, ranches where the ownership question got complicated, estates, failed claims, foreclosures. He buys the debt or the claim from whoever holds it, and then She stopped. He moves quickly. Once he gets the paper, he moves very quickly. And he's been looking at this place? I don't know for certain, but Dalloway's office is in Grasmere. Caldwell does his banking in Grasmere. She turned from the window. The coincidence bothers me. Wyatt looked at the table where Dalloway's papers had been spread out, the leather case long gone. Then we file the reversal, he said. This week. It's a 2-day ride to Grasmere in this weather. I know, he said. You have someone who can watch the place? She looked at him for a moment. Claire is 14. She's also competent, he said, and she has her mother's opinions about everything, which I imagine she'd apply to anyone who came up the road uninvited. Something moved across Evelyn's face, that almost not quite a smile. She would, Evelyn admitted. She's done it before. Then we go to Grasmere, he said. He said we, and neither of them made anything of it. And maybe that was the most significant thing. Two people who had spent their whole lives being careful about what they took on, who they let matter, what they allowed themselves to lean on. Two people like that didn't say we casually. It happened the way most important things happened on the frontier. Without ceremony, in the middle of practical necessity, while the cold pressed down from the north and the cattle shifted in the corrals, and something that needed doing was simply going to have to get done. Evelyn took out the ledger and started calculating what the trip would cost them. Wyatt went to look at the horses and decide which ones could handle the road. Outside, the sky had gone the color of pewter, and the wind was picking up from the northwest, and if you'd been watching from a distance, you'd have seen the smoke from the chimney bend hard to the east, and two people moving with the particular efficiency of people who have stopped arguing about whose problem something is and started treating it as their own. The road to Grasmere in December was not a road so much as a suggestion. 2 days of frozen ruts and wind that came at you sideways off the high plains, cold enough to make your eyes water, and the tears freeze in the corners before they got halfway down your face. Wyatt's leg ached from the first hour, and didn't stop. He said nothing about it, and Evelyn said nothing about it, which was the right call from both of them. They rode mostly in silence, not the uncomfortable kind, but the working kind. Two people with enough to think about and enough sense not to fill the air with words that didn't need to be said. When they stopped at midday on the first day to water the horses and eat what Evelyn had packed, they talked through what they knew about Caldwell and what they didn't, which was a short conversation because the didn't know column was considerably longer than the knew column. "He's not from the territory originally," Evelyn said, breaking apart a piece of hard bread. "Someone told me he came up from Kansas 3 years ago, maybe 4, started buying distressed properties about 2 years back." "Right around when Dalloway's office got the declaration filed," Wyatt said. "I noticed that too." "You think Dalloway's working with him?" She thought about it. "I think Dalloway told him something," she said. "Whether that's working together or just a man talking out of school because Caldwell has money and money makes people talk, I don't know. But Dalloway knew about the competing interests before he came to see you. He didn't stumble onto that at our table." Wyatt ate and looked at the gray sky and thought about a man he'd never met who might be building a legal case for his property while he sat on a frozen road eating hard bread. It produced a specific kind of anger, not hot, but cold and sustained, the kind that didn't burn itself out quickly. "What does he usually do?" Wyatt asked. "Caldwell, his method. He finds the paper," Evelyn said. "Whatever legal instrument gives him a foothold, a debt, a disputed deed, a declaration like yours. Then he files on it before anyone can respond, gets a court order, sends men to enforce it. By the time the rightful owner figures out what happened, the paperwork is done and the law is on his side." She paused. "He did it to a family named Ostrander over near Millhaven. Widow woman and her 3 sons. The eldest boy came home from working a cattle drive to find a marshal's notice on the door and Caldwell's men already inside. Did she fight it? She tried, couldn't afford the legal fees for long enough, ended up settling for pennies." Evelyn folded up the cloth the bread had been wrapped in, neatly, the way she did most things. "That's the other part of the method. Even if you can beat him, he makes the beating expensive." They reached Grasmere on the afternoon of the second day, just as the light was going flat and gray, and the temperature was dropping toward something serious. The town was bigger than Wyatt remembered from his last time through, which had been years ago. 2 more streets east of the main road, a new hotel, the territorial court building with its freshly painted sign looking self-important at the end of the main block. They went to the court first, even before they found somewhere to sleep, because Evelyn's thinking was that getting the filing in before anyone knew they were in town was worth more than a warm room. The clerk was a young man with ink-stained fingers who looked up at them with the expression of someone who had been hoping to close early. "Reversal of death declaration," Wyatt said. "Ashcroft. Filed October 1872. The clerk found it in the records with less difficulty than Wyatt had expected, which suggested it had been accessed recently. He noted that, but said nothing. He filled out the forms the clerk put in front of him. Evelyn had brought 2 letters, one from Dolph Carver and one from a woman named Hattie Briggs in a town called Sutter's Ford, who had apparently known Wyatt for 15 years, attesting to his identity and his being alive, which she produced from inside her coat without being asked. The clerk stamped the filing. "Processing time is 4 to 6 weeks, he said. "Is there a way to expedite?" Evelyn asked. The clerk looked at her. Judge Harmon can sign an interim order within 48 hours if there's a demonstrated urgency. There's a demonstrated urgency, Evelyn said. Who do we see? The clerk told them. They went to see him the next morning. A man named Harmon, who was older than his office and had the tired eyes of someone who had heard most of the stories people could tell him and had developed an efficient system for sorting them. He heard Wyatt's story in about 15 minutes, asked 4 questions, looked at the letters of attestation, and signed the interim order before they were back in their coats. File this at the recorder's office before you leave town, Harmon said, handing the papers to Wyatt. It's not the full reversal, but it establishes your legal standing in the interim. Anyone trying to move on the property in the next 6 weeks runs into this first. Thank you, Wyatt said. Harmon was already looking at the next paper on his desk. Don't thank me, he said. Thank whoever got you those letters of attestation. The filing would have taken the full 6 weeks without them. Wyatt looked at Evelyn when they were back in the corridor. She was reading the interim order with her head down, checking it line by line, the same way she checked the ledger. 8 months ago, he said. She glanced up. You said you started thinking about this 8 months ago, he said. The legal situation. What would happen if I turned up? Yes? So the letters. I asked for them in September, she said, just to have them, in case. She went back to reading the order. He stood there in this cold corridor of the territorial court in Grasmere and looked at a woman who had spent 8 months quietly preparing for a possibility she had no guarantee would ever happen, obtaining letters from his neighbors attesting to his identity for a man who might never come home, on the chance that if he did come home, there would be something left to come home to. He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything adequate to say. They filed the interim order at the recorder's office, and then they went and found a meal that was hot, which was the most important quality it could have had at that point. They almost missed Caldwell entirely. It was Evelyn who saw him, or rather, who saw the name, which was close enough. They were in the hotel dining room that evening when a man at the next table said something to his companion about a property deal that had been held up by a new filing, and Evelyn went very still in a way that Wyatt had started to recognize as meaning she was listening hard while appearing not to. After the men left, she told him what she'd caught. They said Ashcroft Ranch, she said, keeping her voice low. That's not a common name, and they said something about an interim order that complicated the timeline. They already know, Wyatt said. Someone at the courthouse or the recorder's office. Dalloway has contacts there, probably. She turned her coffee cup. The man who said it, did you see him when they came in? Briefly. The one with the gray coat. He had a ring on his right hand, gold, with a dark stone. I've heard Caldwell described. The ring was mentioned. Wyatt looked at the table where the men had been sitting, now empty. He was here in town already. He was already in town, she said. Which means he knew about your situation before we filed today. Dalloway told him, or someone did. They sat with that for a moment. The fire at the end of the room popped. Someone at the bar laughed at something. He's going to try to find a different angle now, Wyatt said. The interim order blocks the direct claim. He'll look for something else. The debt, Evelyn said. Not the bank debt. That's paid. But I had to take a short-term loan to cover operating costs in the second winter. Feed prices went up and I was short. I borrowed from a private lender in Grasmere. She said it without apology, but also without ease. It's mostly paid back. There's about $80 left. Who's the lender? She looked at him. A man named Galt. He operates out of the same building as Dalloway's office. The same building. Wyatt absorbed that. If Caldwell buys that loan from Galt, he has a financial instrument connected to the property, Evelyn said. Small, but it's a foothold, and from a foothold he can file. She paused. I should have paid it off sooner. I was keeping reserves for the winter feed, and it was a judgment call. It was a reasonable judgment call, he said. It was a judgment call that's going to cause us problems. Evelyn, he said, and she stopped. He waited until she looked at him. Reasonable judgment calls cause problems sometimes. That doesn't make them wrong. She held his eyes for a moment. Then she looked back down at her coffee. We need $80, she said, by tomorrow morning, before the lending offices open. They had $63 between them, combined. Wyatt had brought what cash he had, which wasn't much, Most of what he'd earned working his way back south had gone into the travel itself. The remaining $17 was a problem. He thought for a moment. "Hendricks," he said, "the man you have the bull agreement with." "He's in Grassmere?" "He winters here. I know him from years back, not well, but enough. He's a straight dealer." "You want to go ask a man you haven't seen in 3 years for $17 at 8 o'clock at night?" "Yes," Wyatt said. "That's—" She stopped. "All right. Do you know where he stays?" He found Hendricks at the second boarding house he tried, playing cards with 2 other men in the front room and deeply unhappy about his hand. Hendricks looked up, saw Wyatt's face, and dropped his cards on the table with the expression of a man seeing a ghost, which was technically what he was doing. "Hell," Hendricks said. "Ashcroft." "I need $17, Wyatt said. "I'll pay you back in the spring with interest." Hendricks stared at him. "You've been dead. I've been told that. And now you walk in here needing $17. "Yes." Hendricks looked at his cards, then at Wyatt. Then he reached into his vest pocket. "I want the interest at 15%, he said. 10, Wyatt said. 12. "Done." Hendricks counted out $17, handed it over, and then looked up with the expression of a man who'd done the arithmetic on something and found it didn't add up. "This is about that woman at your place, isn't it? Mercer. And whoever's been nosing around your property." Wyatt took the money. "You've heard something?" "Heard a man named Caldwell asking questions about the Ashcroft spread 2 months back. Wanted to know if the original deed had any encumbrances." Hendricks picked his cards back up. "I told him I didn't know anything about it, which wasn't entirely true, but I didn't like his manner." "What's his manner?" "Like a man who's already decided something belongs to him and is just working out the paperwork." Hendricks arranged his hand. "You watch yourself, Ashcroft. He's got people who work for him that I wouldn't want to meet on a dark road." Wyatt thanked him and went back to Evelyn with the $17. They went together to Galt's residence. Not his office, his residence, because waiting until morning meant the office opened first, and Galt might already be in conversation with someone, and knocked on the door at 9 at night and stood on his porch in the cold while he answered in his dressing gown with a lamp and an irritated expression. They paid off the loan. $80 in cash, in front of a witness who happened to be Galt's wife looking over his shoulder in her own dressing gown with an expression that said she'd seen stranger things come to her door but wasn't enjoying this particular instance. Galt gave them a receipt. Walking back to the hotel, Evelyn said, "He's going to know by morning." "Caldwell?" "Galt will tell him. Or Dalloway. They'll all tell each other." She held the receipt in her gloved hand. "But it won't matter because the loan is gone and the interim order is filed and there's nothing to grab." "For now," Wyatt said. "For now," she agreed. Sit. They rode home in conditions that were worse than the ride out. A real winter storm had come in from the northwest overnight, and by the time they cleared the edge of Grassmere, the wind was kicking up hard and the snow was coming sideways. Wyatt's leg, which had been bad on the way out, was considerably worse on the way back. He'd stiffened up in the cold, and the motion of the horse was grinding something in the joint that hadn't been ground before. And by the afternoon of the first day, he was white around the mouth with it, though he said nothing. Evelyn noticed. She always noticed things, which he was coming to understand was one of her fundamental qualities, like the way some people were fundamentally impatient or fundamentally generous. She was fundamentally observant, and it had probably kept her alive through some of what she'd been through. She didn't mention the leg. She just set a slightly slower pace without explaining why, and when they stopped at a farmstead to shelter from the worst of the afternoon wind, she made sure there was a place for him to sit where the joint wouldn't stiffen further. He was grateful for it and slightly irritated by it in the way that you're irritated when someone helps you with something you are determined to handle yourself, even when the help is clearly warranted. They made it back in 2.5 days instead of 2. Clara met them in the yard with an expression that was trying to be only practical and was mostly succeeding. "A man came yesterday," Clara said, "while you were gone." Evelyn was off her horse before Clara finished the sentence. "What man?" "He said his name was Aldrich. He had a letter he wanted to leave. I told him there was no one to accept correspondence and he'd have to come back." Clara paused. "He said he'd be back. Did he say who he was working for?" "No. but he asked how long the place had been running cattle and whether the current operation had been established before or after. Clara stopped. She looked at Wyatt. Before or after your death was declared. The three of them stood in the yard with the snow blowing around them. Nora appeared in the doorway of the house, watching. You handled it right, Evelyn told Clara. I know, Clara said. She wasn't being arrogant about it. She was just certain. It was a quality Wyatt had already come to recognize in her as slightly exhausting and fundamentally admirable. They went inside. Wyatt sat at the kitchen table while Evelyn made coffee, and Clara reported in full what the man Aldrich had said and done and what he'd looked at while he was in the yard, because Clara had apparently cataloged all of it with the attention of someone who understood that details mattered. He'd looked at the corrals for a long time. He'd looked at the barn roof. He'd asked about the water rights on the east pasture, which was a specific enough question that it couldn't have been casual. Water rights, Wyatt said. Evelyn set a cup in front of him. The creek that runs through the east pasture has a registered diversion right. I filed it 18 months ago. It was lapsed when I arrived. She sat down. If someone could challenge the registration, argue it was filed by a third party without legal standing because the property owner was declared dead, it would be another foothold, Wyatt said. A bigger one, she said. Water rights in this territory are worth more than the land in dry years. He drank his coffee and thought about Caldwell, who he'd still never seen clearly, just a man in a gray coat at a table in a hotel dining room, a ring with a dark stone that Evelyn had noticed, and he hadn't. A man who had been quietly building a case for someone else's land for months, maybe longer, the way you build something you intend to keep. The water rights filing, Wyatt said. Who registered it? I filed it in my name on behalf of the property, Evelyn said. There's a question of whether that's valid if my occupancy of the property was... Your occupancy wasn't unauthorized, Wyatt said. You paid the debt. You had standing. I had practical standing, she said. The legal standing is what's being questioned. He put down the cup. Then we get a lawyer. Evelyn was quiet. What? He said. Lawyers cost money, she said. We paid $80 last night and spent what we had on the trip. The margin we had going into winter is gone, he said. Thin, she said, which was her version of gone. Nora had come in from the doorway and was sitting in the chair by the stove doing something with a piece of string, one of those cat's cradle patterns children made. She was not appearing to listen. She was absolutely listening. Is there a lawyer in Grasmere? Wyatt asked. 2. One of them does work for Dalloway's office. She said it flatly, without editorial, but the editorial was there. The other one? A woman named Pratt. She took the bar 3 years ago. She's handled a few land cases. Evelyn paused. I've been told she's good. Have you met her? Once, briefly. Another pause. She struck me as someone who doesn't like to lose. Wyatt thought about it. A lawyer who didn't like to lose and who had no obvious connection to Caldwell or Dalloway was, at this moment, the most valuable thing he could think of. More valuable than $80. More valuable than the interim order even, because the interim order was a delay, and what they needed was a permanent resolution. Write to her, he said, tonight. Explain the situation, all of it, the declaration, the interim order, Caldwell, the water rights filing, all of it. Ask what she'd charge and what she thinks the case looks like. Evelyn looked at him for a moment. What if she says the case is weak? Then at least we know what we're dealing with. She got up and went to the desk in the corner, his desk, Margaret's writing paper still in the bottom drawer, which Evelyn had been using because it was there, and paper was paper. He watched her sit down and uncap the ink and begin writing, and he thought about the strangeness of it. A woman he'd met 5 weeks ago writing letters on his dead wife's stationery to protect a property that the law hadn't fully decided was his, while the wind came down off the mountain and the fire in the stove worked against the cold. And her daughters moved quietly through the house around them both. Clara came and stood near Wyatt's chair without sitting down. She had something she wanted to say. He could tell by the way she was standing, weight shifted, not quite settled. The man Aldrich, she said. When he was looking at the corrals, he counted the cattle. Wyatt looked up at her. You saw him do it. I watched him from the kitchen window. He counted twice. She paused. He wrote something down. What did he write it in? A small book, brown cover. Wyatt thought about a man with a small brown book standing in his yard counting his cattle, and the cold, specific anger came back, the sustained kind, the kind that didn't spend itself quickly. "You did right to tell me," he said. Clara nodded once and went away, practical and satisfied. Nora, by the stove, had worked her string into a complicated pattern and was studying it with the focused attention she brought to most things. She didn't look up, but after a moment she said, without apparent context, "Mama says when someone wants something you have, you should find out what they're afraid of." Wyatt looked at her. "What do you mean?" Nora considered the string pattern. "She says people who take things usually do it because they're scared of not having enough. And if you know what they're scared of, you know how to stop them." She looked up at him finally. "She says that's true even when what they're doing is wrong." Evelyn's pen had stopped moving at the desk. She wasn't looking at them, but the pause in the writing said she'd heard. Wyatt thought about Pierce Dalloway with his leather case and his careful language about competing interests. He thought about Caldwell in his gray coat, asking about water rights and cattle counts through a man named Aldrich who wrote things in a brown book. He thought about what Hendricks had said, like a man who's already decided something belongs to him and is just working out the paperwork. What was a man like that afraid of? Losing the paperwork, losing the legal ground, losing the appearance of legitimacy that was the only thing separating what he did from plain taking. If Caldwell needed the law to be on his side, needed the declaration, needed the loan instrument, needed the water rights question to go unanswered, then what hurt him was the opposite: a clean record, a living owner with documented standing, a lawyer who understood the game and didn't mind playing it. Every piece of paper they filed, every question they answered before he could exploit it, every legal foothold they secured, that was what Caldwell was afraid of. Evelyn's pen started moving again. Wyatt looked at the fire in the stove and thought about the spring and what the ranch would need to look like by then, and what Caldwell would look like by then if everything they were doing was right. And he found that the cold anger had shifted into something else, not quite calm, but adjacent to it, purposeful, directed. He was alive. The interim order was filed. The loan was paid. The property was standing. The cattle were in the corrals. The fence line ran straight and tight. None of it was secure yet. He knew that clearly. The next months were going to require more than he probably had in him, and more than Evelyn should reasonably have to give. And things were going to go wrong in ways neither of them could predict, because things always did. The frontier wasn't a place that rewarded optimism. It was a place that ground you down and occasionally, if you were stubborn enough and lucky enough and had the right people beside you, let you find what was left when the grinding stopped. He reached across the table and pulled the ledger toward him and opened it to the last written page and started doing the calculations for what the spring cattle sale would need to produce and what the legal fees might run to and where the margins were and where they weren't. Outside, the wind had dropped a little. The fire worked steadily against the cold, and in the corner of the room, Evelyn Mercer wrote a careful letter to a lawyer named Pratt, describing a situation that was complicated and urgent and not yet lost, in the handwriting that had kept 2 years of accounts for a dead man's ranch. And that was, Wyatt was beginning to understand, one of the most precise and honest things he'd ever had the chance to read. Ruth Pratt wrote back in 11 days, which was faster than either of them had expected given the weather and the distance. The letter was 4 pages long and written in a hand so small and dense that Evelyn had to tilt it toward the window light to read it properly. Wyatt watched her face while she read, which told him more than the letter did before she'd said a word about it. She read it twice. Then she set it on the table and looked at him. "She says the case is winnable," Evelyn said. "But she also says Caldwell has done this before in 3 other territories, and he's good at it. He finds lawyers who know the local judges, and he files early and he files often, and he buries the other side in paperwork until they can't afford to keep answering it. What does she need from us? Everything. The original deed, the bank's records of the debt and its payment, the interim order, the water rights filing, the loan receipt from Galt." Evelyn ran her finger down the second page. "She also wants a written account of the sequence of events, who did what and when, going back to when you left for the drive. She says the timeline is the case. If the timeline is clean and documented, Caldwell doesn't have a gap to work in. And her fee," Evelyn looked at the last page. "She'll take $40 now and the rest contingent on outcome. She says if she wins, her fee is $120 total. If she doesn't win, We only owe the 40. Wyatt thought about $40 and where it was going to come from. She also says, Evelyn continued, that we should not speak to Dalloway again without her present. She underlined that twice. Twice, Wyatt said. She underlines things she means seriously. Evelyn folded the letter. I think we should hire her. So do I, he said. Right back today. The $40 came from selling 2 steers earlier than they'd planned. Not the heifers Evelyn had wanted to hold back, but 2 of the younger bulls that weren't going to improve with another winter on them. Carver bought them without much negotiation, which told Wyatt that Carver felt guilty about something, though Wyatt couldn't determine exactly what. The money went to Grassmere with the letter, carried by a freighter Hendricks vouched for, along with every document they had in a leather satchel that Evelyn organized so methodically it amounted to an argument on its own. February was brutal in the way that February on the high plains was always brutal, not dramatic, just relentless. The kind of cold that didn't arrive with a storm and leave, but settled in like an unwelcome relative and made itself at home. The cattle had to be fed from reserves, which drew down the hay faster than Wyatt had planned for. And there was a week in the middle of the month when 3 of the younger calves were touch and go, and Evelyn slept in the barn 2 nights running because she'd had calves die on her before, and she wasn't going to watch it happen again if she could do something about it. All 3 calves lived. Evelyn came in on the 3rd morning with hay in her hair and her coat smelling like cattle, and sat down at the kitchen table and put her head in her hands for about 30 seconds, and then she got up and started the coffee. Wyatt didn't say anything about the 30 seconds. Some things were private even when they happened in front of you. Ruth Pratt's second letter arrived in late February with a different quality to it. Shorter, more precise, less explanation, and more instruction. She had reviewed the documents. She had identified 2 filings that Caldwell had made in Grassmere that Wyatt and Evelyn hadn't known about. Preliminary inquiries, technically not formal claims, but designed to establish a paper trail that would support a formal claim if he chose to make one. She had responded to both with counterfilings that she did not explain in detail but described as the appropriate answer to an inappropriate question. She also wrote that Caldwell had hired a lawyer named Forsyth, who was known in 3 territories and not well regarded in any of them, which she considered a meaningful data point. Men who hired Forsyth were not confident in the strength of their position. They were confident in their willingness to be aggressive about a weak one, which was different, and which Ruth Pratt, from the tone of the letter, found less intimidating than Caldwell probably hoped. I want to meet her, Evelyn said when she'd read the letter. We'll need to go to Grassmere again, Wyatt said. I know, but I want to look at her when she talks. She set the letter down. I've made decisions based on paper before and it's gone wrong. I want to see her face. They went in March, when the worst of the winter had broken enough to make the road passable, leaving Clara in charge with instructions that were detailed enough to constitute a small manual of ranch operations, which Clara accepted with the gravity of someone who had been waiting to be trusted with exactly this amount of responsibility. Ruth Pratt's office was in a building on the east side of Grassmere's main street, up a narrow staircase that had been built by someone who hadn't fully thought through the load it would need to carry. The office itself was small and stacked with documents organized in a system that only she apparently understood, and she was sitting behind a desk that was buried under paper when they came in, reading something closely enough that she finished the paragraph before she looked up. She was younger than Wyatt had expected, somewhere in her mid-30s, with dark eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of contained energy that made the small room feel slightly smaller. She stood and shook Evelyn's hand first, then Wyatt's, and gestured to the 2 chairs across from her desk without preamble. You're both calmer than most clients I see in this kind of situation, she said, sitting back down. Is that good or bad? Evelyn asked. Useful, Ruth said. Panicked clients make decisions for emotional reasons. That helps Forsyth. She opened a folder. Tell me about Aldrich, the man who came to the property in December. They told her. She listened without interrupting, making occasional notes in the margin of whatever document was on top of her folder. When they finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at her notes. Caldwell sent him to establish the operating history of the ranch under contested ownership, she said. He wants to argue that the cattle operation as it currently exists was built during a period of legal ambiguity, that Evelyn's occupancy and improvement of the property wasn't authorized because the owner was declared dead, and therefore the property was, in a technical sense, in a kind of legal limbo. He wants to peel off the improvements and the water rights and argue they accrued to the property in a state that made them available for legitimate claim.
Can he do that? Wyatt asked. He's going to try to do that, Ruth said. Whether he can depends on how well we close the gaps before he files. She looked at Evelyn. The water rights filing, you filed it in your own name? On behalf of the property, Evelyn said. The language in the filing specifies that I was acting as operator of the Ashcroft property.
That's good. That's better than if you'd filed it in your own name as owner, but Forsyth is going to argue that an operator without legal authority, because the owner was declared dead and no legal guardianship or management agreement was established, couldn't create a binding water rights registration. Ruth took off her glasses and cleaned them with her sleeve, a gesture that seemed habitual rather than deliberate. What I need is evidence that your presence on the property wasn't occupancy. It was stewardship. There's a legal difference. Occupancy implies you were there for your own benefit. Stewardship implies you were there on behalf of the absent owner. She paid the bank debt to preserve the property, Wyatt said. That's stewardship. Yes, and that's our strongest argument. The question is whether the payment of the debt created a legal relationship, effectively an implied trust arrangement, that gave her the authority to act on behalf of the estate. Ruth put her glasses back on. I think it did. Forsyth will argue it didn't. The judge will decide. Which judge? Evelyn asked. Ruth paused. A brief, controlled pause. Judge Corrigan. He's the circuit judge for property matters in this territory. Something in the pause made Wyatt look at her more carefully. You know him. I know his record, she said. He's fair. He's also slow, which helps us and hurts Caldwell. Caldwell's method relies on speed. He moves before the other side can organize. Corrigan doesn't allow that. He schedules at his own pace, and he requires full documentation from both parties before he'll hear anything. She looked at them both. Which means this is probably going to run until summer. You need to be prepared for that. We're prepared, Evelyn said. Ruth looked at her for a moment, then, Can I ask you something directly? Yes, Evelyn said. When you moved on to the property, when you paid the debt and moved in, did you have any intention of eventually claiming it for yourself, even in the back of your mind? The question sat in the small room. Wyatt looked at Evelyn. Evelyn was looking at Ruth Pratt with the level, unhurried attention she brought to things she was taking seriously. No, she said. I had 2 daughters to raise and a debt I felt I owed to a man I'd never met. That was the whole of it. Ruth held her gaze for another moment. Then she made a note. Good, because Forsyth is going to ask you exactly that question, probably in those words, and you need to answer it the same way in the courtroom that you just answered it here. On the ride back, they didn't talk much for the first hour. The road was still rough, but the air had softened, the edge of winter beginning to pull back from it. Not spring yet, not even close, but the suggestion of it somewhere ahead. The mountains to the north were still white down to the tree line, but the sky above them had that particular blue that only came when the worst of the cold was finished. She's good, Evelyn said eventually. Yes, Wyatt said. She's also going to cost us more than $120 before this is over. Probably, he said. I just want you to know I know that. He looked at her, riding beside him with her coat collar up and her eyes forward. I know you know that, he said. She nodded, and they rode on. Spring came with the usual chaos and the usual relief and the usual set of problems that winter had left behind for spring to discover. 3 fence sections on the north pasture had collapsed under snow load. The creek had shifted its course 6 feet east during the thaw, which was going to require the water diversion to be repositioned. 2 of the heifers calved early, and one of the calves was small in a way that required careful watching. They worked. That was the simple version of everything that happened between March and June, and the simple version was also the accurate one. They got up before light, and they worked until the light was gone, and they fell into the rhythms that working land imposes on people who work it seriously. The arguments about which fence to fix first, the disagreements about feed ratios, the particular friction of 2 people who had different ways of doing things that were both reasonable ways of doing things, learning to negotiate which way they were going to do it together. There were bad days. Wyatt's leg had a week in April where it was bad enough that he was limping visibly, and sharp about it when Evelyn noticed. And she had the sense not to push, but also didn't pretend not to notice. which was a difficult balance, and she managed it imperfectly. She said something once that came out more like concern than practicality, and he shut it down harder than he needed to, and the silence afterward lasted most of the afternoon. He apologized that evening, which cost him something, and she accepted it without making it cost him more, which was its own kind of generosity. Nora planted a kitchen garden in April, on the south side of the house where the light was good. She didn't ask permission, and she didn't announce she was doing it. She just started turning the soil one morning and kept at it over a week until she had 4 rows of seedlings in and a border of something flowering along the edge that Wyatt didn't know the name of. He noticed it one evening and stood looking at it for a moment. The border was in almost exactly the same position as the border Margaret had always grown, though the flowers were different. He didn't say anything to Nora about it. He wasn't sure what he'd say. The next morning, she was out there pulling up something that was growing where it shouldn't be, and he stopped on his way to the barn. "What are those?" he asked, meaning the border flowers. "Marigolds," Nora said. "They keep the rabbits out." "Practical," he said. "Mama says if you can make something pretty and useful at the same time, that's better than just one or the other." She looked up at him. "Did your wife garden?" "She did," he said. Nora went back to her weeding. "I thought so," she said, in the tone of someone whose suspicion had been confirmed. He went on to the barn. In May, Caldwell made his formal filing. Ruth Pratt sent word via a rider she paid herself, a measure of how seriously she was taking the timeline. And the filing was exactly what she'd predicted, a claim of adverse interest based on legal uncertainty during the period of the death declaration, targeting specifically the water rights registration and a secondary claim on what Forsyth was calling improvements of disputed provenance, which was a lawyer's way of saying the barn roof, the fence sections, the herd expansion, and probably the kitchen garden if he was being thorough about it. "He's filing on the improvements," Evelyn said. She was reading Ruth's letter at the kitchen table with the particular stillness she went to when something made her angry. Not the moving around kind of anger, but the very quiet kind. "He's claiming partial interest in the cattle operation because the herd was built during the disputed period." "Can he get the cattle?" Clara asked. She was 16 now and had been listening to enough of this to understand most of the shape of it. "He's trying to establish that some portion of the herd value accrued during a period where the property had no valid owner," Evelyn said. "If a judge agreed with that argument, he won't," Wyatt said. Evelyn looked at him. "Ruth said Corrigan requires full documentation before he'll hear anything," Wyatt said. "We have the documentation. Every purchase, every breeding decision, every head counted and recorded since Evelyn arrived. That ledger is 2 years of evidence that the operation was managed by an identified person with a clear stated purpose. Forsyth is going to have to argue against a paper trail that doesn't have a gap in it." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "The ledger," she said slowly. "Yes. I kept it in my name," she said. "Every entry. Because it was my operation. I thought of it that way. Taking care of something for someone else. I wrote Mercer operation on behalf of Ashcroft property in the front page." He looked at her. "You wrote that in the front page." "When I started it, I didn't want there to be any question about what I was doing there." She paused. "Ruth is going to want that ledger." He got up from the table. "Then we send it to her tomorrow." They sent the ledger to Ruth Pratt the next day, along with a letter from Wyatt formally attesting that Evelyn Mercer had acted as his authorized steward, retroactively documented as Ruth had advised in an earlier letter, using language Ruth herself had drafted for exactly this purpose. It wasn't a perfect solution, Ruth had said so herself. But it was a good faith documented position, and good faith documented positions were what Corrigan rewarded. What happened in June surprised all of them, including Ruth. Hendricks came to the ranch on a Tuesday morning in late June, earlier than he usually showed up for anything, and he had 2 other ranchers with him, a man named Colbert, who ran a spread 15 miles north, and a woman named Frances Ochoa, who had operated her family's ranch alone since her husband's death 4 years prior. Wyatt met them in the yard. "Heard what Caldwell's doing," Hendricks said, without greeting. "Heard about the filing." "Word gets around," Wyatt said. "Word gets around because people talk, and people are talking about this because they're worried." Hendricks looked at Colbert and Ochoa. "He's not just after your place, Ashcroft. Colbert's got a cousin who had a property in the Northern District. Caldwell ran the same play on him 18 months ago. Different details, same method.
Frances Ochoa crossed her arms. She was a compact woman with weathered hands and a direct way of looking at things, like she'd taken a long time to develop patience and had stopped developing it somewhere short of complete. My water rights on the South Branch are filed under similar circumstances to yours. My husband died without a formal estate filing. We just ran the operation the way you do. If Caldwell wins your case, he has a precedent. She looked at Wyatt steadily.
We'd like to file supporting statements with your lawyer, character attestations, operating history documentation. Whatever she says is useful. If it helps your case hold, it helps ours. Wyatt stood in the yard and looked at the three of them and felt something he hadn't expected to feel. Not moved exactly, but aware of something. The way you're aware of the temperature changing before you consciously register that it's warmer. That's not a small thing to do, he said. No, Hendricks said. But small things are what Caldwell counts on. He counts on people handling their own problems alone because they're too proud or too busy or too scared to make it someone else's problem. He shrugged. We've decided to be inconvenient. He brought them inside. Evelyn was at the desk, and she stood when they came in, and there was a brief moment of introduction, and then they were all around the table. Too many people for the kitchen, really, chairs pulled from the other room, and the coffee pot working overtime. And they spent 2 hours going through everything, what Ruth needed, what the case looked like, where the pressure points were. Frances Ochoa had records going back 8 years on her water rights and was willing to provide them as supporting documentation showing regional practice. Colbert had a signed statement from the judge in the Northern District case that Caldwell had pursued, a statement the judge had apparently made to Colbert's cousin, expressing reservations about Forsyth's methods that stopped just short of being actionable. Hendricks had something simpler and possibly more useful. A signed affidavit from a man who had been in Galt's office the day Caldwell purchased 3 other small loans from the same lender, establishing a pattern of behavior going back further than anyone had demonstrated on paper. This is a pattern case, Evelyn said, looking at the documents on the table. Ruth's been building the individual case, but if we can show Corrigan that this is what Caldwell does, systematically, in multiple territories, using the same instruments, it changes the argument, Wyatt said. It's not a property dispute. It's a predatory scheme. Yes, Evelyn said. They sent everything to Ruth Pratt in a package so large it required a separate rider. Ruth wrote back in 10 days. Her letter was the shortest she'd sent yet, half a page in that small, dense hand, and it said 3 things. First, that the supporting documentation changed the case significantly. Second, that she was filing a supplementary argument with Corrigan that included the pattern evidence. Third, that she believed Caldwell would likely seek to settle before the hearing rather than let the pattern evidence become part of the court record. That last point sat in Wyatt's mind for several days. A settlement meant Caldwell would offer something in exchange for making the problem go away quietly. Money, a withdrawal of the filing, some negotiated outcome that let him preserve his position in other territories by keeping his methods out of the court record. Ruth had said it like it was a tactical prediction, not a recommendation, and she was right to say it that way because the decision about whether to settle was not hers. He talked to Evelyn about it on a Sunday evening in late June when the work was done for the day, and the girls were in the other room, and the light was going slow and golden out the west window the way it did in summer when the days were long. If he offers a settlement, Wyatt said. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She was mending something, Clara's coat, the left elbow that kept wearing through. What about it? What do you want to do? She set the mending down. What are the options? We settle, we get some kind of resolution, and he goes away. Or we go to the hearing, and we put the pattern evidence in front of Corrigan, and we either win completely or we lose badly because there's no middle in a full hearing. What does Ruth think? Ruth thinks he'll settle. She thinks he's afraid of the record. What do you think? He looked out the window at the yard, the corrals, the cottonwoods in the far corner of the property, the grave under them, the ground around it clean and tended. I think settling means he goes somewhere else and does the same thing to someone who doesn't have Hendricks and Ochoa and Colbert behind them, he said. I think the only thing that actually stops him is the record. Evelyn picked up the mending again. She looked at it for a moment without sewing. Then we don't settle, she said. It wasn't a dramatic statement. She said it the way she made most decisions, after looking at the thing from all sides and then saying what she thought clearly,
without dressing it up. "It's a risk," he said. "Most things worth doing are," she said, and went back to the mending.
He sat there for a while in the fading light. The house was quiet, in the way it was quiet when people were in it, but not needing anything from each other. The particular ease of that, which he hadn't felt in a long time and was only beginning to recognize as something he'd been missing without knowing what to call the missing. Ruth Pratt filed the full supplementary argument with the pattern evidence on a Thursday in early July. Caldwell's offer of settlement arrived, through Forsyth, on the following Monday. Ruth communicated Wyatt's response in a single sentence that was, by the standards of legal correspondence, almost impolitely brief. The hearing was scheduled for the first week of September. Wyatt and Evelyn spent the summer working the ranch and preparing what Ruth needed and arguing occasionally about things that didn't matter and not arguing about things that did, which was its own kind of progress. Clara turned 17 and declared intentions about going to Cheyenne to study, which Evelyn received with the expression of someone who'd known it was coming and hadn't found a way to be ready for it. Nora's garden produced more than anyone had expected, including Nora. The small calf that had needed watching in March had grown into the strongest animal in the group, which Evelyn said was often the way with things that started hard. Wyatt didn't say anything to that, but he thought about it for a while afterward, in the way that simple true things sometimes settle into you slowly and don't fully land until they do. The hearing was set for the 7th of September, which arrived the way important days always do, unremarkably, with ordinary weather, as if the calendar had no particular opinion about what was riding on it. They rode to Grasmere the day before. All of them, which hadn't been the original plan. Clara had decided she was going and made the announcement with the particular finality she brought to things she'd already decided, and Nora had simply appeared in the yard with her bag packed and looked at her mother until Evelyn said, "Fine." Hendricks rode separately, but arrived at the same boarding house within the hour, and Frances Ochoa came in from the north with Colbert behind her, and by that evening there were 7 people connected to the Ashcroft Ranch eating supper together in the hotel dining room in a way that made the other guests look over occasionally, trying to work out what the occasion was. Ruth Pratt joined them after supper. She had the contained, slightly coiled quality of someone whose mind was still working even when her body had stopped moving, and she went through the next morning's sequence with Wyatt and Evelyn at the end of the table while the others talked around them, what Forsyth would argue first, what Corrigan tended to respond to, where the pattern evidence would land hardest. The key moment, Ruth said, is when Forsyth tries to characterize Evelyn's occupancy as self-interested. He's going to phrase it carefully, but that's the argument, that she moved onto the property for her own benefit, and the stewardship framing is a retroactive legal construction. She looked at Evelyn. When that happens, and it will happen, don't react. Don't look at me. Don't look at Wyatt. Look at Corrigan. Why Corrigan? Evelyn asked. Because he's going to be watching you when Forsyth says it. He makes judgments about people as much as about arguments. He's been on the bench 22 years, and he's heard every version of every story. What he's looking for is whether the person across from him is telling the truth or telling a version of it. Ruth picked up her coffee cup. You've been telling the truth. That's not nothing. It actually matters in his courtroom. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. And if he decides it was self-interested, even partly, then we have the pattern evidence and the ledger and the documented timeline, and we argue it on the merits, Ruth said. But I'd rather not need to lean on that entirely. She looked at both of them. Get some sleep. Both of you. I mean it. Neither of them slept much, which was honest and also predictable. Wyatt lay in the dark of the boarding house room listening to Grasmere settle into its nighttime sounds, a dog somewhere, the distant rattle of something metal in the wind, and thought about the chain of things that had led him here. The cattle drive he'd left on 4 years ago, the avalanche, the trapper's cabin and the long winter and the longer road back, the smoke from his own chimney when he'd crested the ridge of his property and seen it, which had stopped him cold on the road and made him stand there longer than he probably needed to before he went up to the door. He thought about the thing he'd done in Hatcher's Creek that he couldn't remember doing. Paid a stranger's debt because apparently he'd seen a situation and had the money, and it had seemed like the thing to do. He must have been a different kind of man then. Not better, necessarily, but less burdened, with enough surplus to give something away without keeping a record of it. The years since Margaret died had taken something out of him that he hadn't fully noticed going until it was already gone. What Evelyn had done with that forgotten act, carried it across years and loss and exhaustion, turned it into 2 years of grinding work on someone else's land, kept a grave clean that had nothing to do with her own grief. That wasn't repayment. You couldn't call it repayment because it was too large for the word. It was something else. He didn't have a clean name for it, and maybe that was all right. Some things resisted clean names. He fell asleep sometime around 3 and woke before dawn and lay there for a while before he got up. Judge Corrigan's courtroom was smaller than Wyatt had imagined it. A room that was trying to be formal and mostly succeeding, with high windows that let in the September morning light at an angle that put Forsyth's table mostly in shadow and Wyatt and Evelyn's table mostly in light, which Ruth had known would be the case and had arranged their seating accordingly. Forsyth was a tall man with the kind of silver hair that looked deliberately maintained, and he arranged his papers with the confidence of someone who'd been in a lot of courtrooms and found them comfortable. He glanced at Ruth Pratt once when the proceedings began, and she looked back at him the way you look at something you've already figured out. Corrigan was older than Wyatt had pictured, mid-60s, with a face that had organized itself over the decades into an expression of permanent, non-hostile skepticism. He read both filings before he said anything, which took 15 minutes, during which the room was very quiet. Then he looked up and nodded at Forsyth to begin. Forsyth made his argument cleanly, which Wyatt had to give him credit for. He didn't overreach in the opening, didn't try to do too much. He established the death declaration, established the period of legal uncertainty, and described Evelyn's presence on the property as an opportunistic occupancy that had retroactively been dressed in the language of stewardship. He said the word retroactive 4 times, each time with a slightly different emphasis, like he was driving a nail from different angles. Ruth let him finish without visible reaction. Then she stood up, and she started with the ledger. She had it on the table in front of her, and she read from the front page, the inscription Evelyn had written before the first entry, Mercer operation on behalf of Ashcroft property, with the date. She pointed out that this had been written before anyone in the territory had reason to believe Wyatt was alive, before Ruth Pratt existed in the case, before there was any legal incentive to frame things in terms of stewardship rather than occupancy. A woman operating a property for her own benefit, Ruth said, does not write the owner's name on the front page of her own ledger. She writes her own name. The document in front of you was created for the same reason all records are created, to establish what was true at the time of creation. What was true at the time of creation is what my client states it to be now. Corrigan looked at the ledger. Then he looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked back at him. Not defiantly, just directly, the way she looked at things she wasn't going to flinch from. Forsyth's counter was the retroactive authorization argument, that Wyatt's formal attestation of Evelyn's stewardship had been drafted with Ruth Pratt's assistance after the fact, and therefore could not be relied upon to establish what Evelyn's standing had been during the period in question. Ruth said that the attestation was documentation of a fact, not creation of one, and that the distinction mattered legally and logically. She said it calmly, without heat, the way you say something when you know you're right and don't need to perform the rightness. Then she filed the pattern evidence. She walked Corrigan through it methodically. The Ostrander case, Colbert's cousin in the Northern District, the affidavit about Galt's loan sales, the documented timeline of Caldwell's activity in 3 territories. She laid it out the way you lay out something that has an obvious shape once you can see all the pieces, each item connected to the next, the pattern emerging not as assertion but as consequence. Forsyth objected 3 times during that portion. Corrigan sustained none of them. When Forsyth cross-examined Evelyn, he asked her the question Ruth had predicted, whether she had moved onto the property for her own benefit. He phrased it carefully, as expected, wrapping it in language about financial circumstances and opportunity, but the question underneath the language was the one Ruth had told her was coming. Evelyn answered it the same way she'd answered it in Ruth's office. No, she had 2 daughters to raise and a debt she felt she owed to a man she'd never met. That was the whole of it. Forsyth asked if she had considered what would happen to herself and her daughters if she'd been unable to manage the ranch successfully. She said yes, she had considered it. He asked what she had concluded. She said she had concluded that she would manage it successfully, or she would face whatever came next when it came. She said she hadn't spent much time on the second option because the first one required all her attention. Corrigan wrote something down. Forsyth tried twice more to establish self-interest. coming at it from different angles, and each time Evelyn answered simply and without elaboration, which was the right approach, because elaboration was what cross-examination fed on. Ruth had told her that. She'd listened. When it was over, the arguments, the counter-arguments, the documentation, all of it, Corrigan said he would consider the matter and render a decision within 30 days. He gathered his papers and left the bench, and the room began to breathe again. Ruth came around the table and said, "You did well," to Evelyn, and said it without inflection, which from Ruth meant she meant it. Evelyn nodded once. She looked tired in a deep way, the kind of tired that isn't about sleep. Outside the courthouse, Hendricks shook Wyatt's hand. Frances Ochoa said the pattern evidence had been the right call, and she said it like a woman who understood the cost of right calls and was acknowledging it. Colbert said nothing but stood with them in the September morning, which was its own kind of solidarity. Clara had been sitting in the gallery. When they came out, she fell into step beside her mother and didn't say anything for a while, and then she said quietly, "You were steady in there." "I was scared," Evelyn said. "You were scared and you were steady," Clara said. "That's the harder one." Acid. Corrigan's decision came in 22 days, 8 days ahead of his stated timeline, which Ruth said was meaningful, that judges who had doubt took the full time, and judges who didn't often moved sooner. The decision was full and complete. Evelyn's occupancy was ruled lawful stewardship under an implied trust established by the payment of the original debt. The water rights registration was upheld as valid, executed by an authorized operator on behalf of the property's rightful owner. All of Caldwell's filings were dismissed. Forsyth's argument about the improvements was rejected in language that Wyatt read 3 times because it was more direct than he'd expected judicial language to be. Corrigan had written that characterizing the preservation of an absent owner's property as adverse interest was a misapplication of the legal doctrine, and that the court found no merit in the argument under any reasonable interpretation. There was a final paragraph that addressed Caldwell directly, noting that the pattern evidence presented suggested a systematic approach to exploiting legal ambiguity in property disputes, and recommending that the Territorial Attorney General review the documented cases for potential violations of territorial fraud statutes. Ruth sent a separate note with the decision. It said, "This is the outcome. The work after this is keeping it." They were right about the cost. The legal fees came to just over $200 by the time everything was settled, which was more than Wyatt had and more than Evelyn had. And the way they handled it was the way they handled most things by then. They looked at the numbers together, figured out what was possible, sold 4 head they'd been planning to keep through another winter, and paid Ruth Pratt in full before they paid anything else. Ruth had earned it and then some, and paying people what they'd earned was a principle Wyatt held to even when it was inconvenient. He wrote to Ruth afterward, not a formal letter but a plain one, and said that if she ever had a client in a property situation without resources, she could send them and the Ashcroft Ranch would provide whatever supporting documentation was useful. He didn't make a production of it. It was just a thing that seemed right to do with the experience they'd had. Ruth wrote back a short note that said she appreciated it and she'd remember it, and he believed her. Oh. The autumn after the hearing had a quality to it that Wyatt noticed but didn't say much about. A kind of exhaled relief. The feeling of a knot worked loose that you'd been carrying so long you'd forgotten it was there. The ranch ran. The cattle were healthy. The fence line held. The water rights were clean on paper and clean in practice. The creek running where it was supposed to run. He and Evelyn were different with each other than they'd been in those first weeks, though neither of them had made a conscious decision to change. The change had happened the way most things happened between people who worked closely and honestly together, gradually, through accumulated small moments that didn't individually mean much and collectively meant a great deal. He noticed things about her now that he hadn't at the start. The way she got very quiet when something was genuinely worrying her. Not chatty quiet, but deep quiet, the kind that had weight to it. The way she laughed when something struck her as actually funny. Not the polite almost laugh, but a real one that surprised her a little each time. Like she hadn't been expecting to find it. The way she looked at the land in the evening sometimes, standing at the fence line or on the porch, with an expression he recognized because he'd had it himself years ago, when he and Margaret were first building this place, and everything still had the quality of something being created rather than something being maintained. One evening in October, he came out of the barn and found her standing at the fence on the west side,
looking out at the valley where the last of the sunlight was lying flat across the grass. He stopped beside her without planning to. They stood there for a while without talking. "I've been thinking about the spring herd," she said finally. "So have I," he said. "We should look at buying 2 more heifers if we can find the right breeding. The herd's old enough to support it. Hendricks might know someone." "That's what I was thinking." She was quiet for a moment. "The water rights renewal comes up in 3 years. We should start the documentation now, not wait. Ruth will know the process. I'll write to her." He looked out at the valley. The light had gone orange, and the shadows were coming long from the east. Below the cottonwoods in the corner of the yard, the grave marker caught the last of the light. Pale against the dark ground, the stone he'd set himself in the winter after Margaret died, before he'd left for the drive. "I go out there sometimes," Evelyn said, and he knew what she meant without her having to specify. "Not often, just sometimes." He didn't say anything for a moment. "I know," he said. "I hope that's—" She paused. "I hope that's not wrong." He thought about a woman he'd never known tending a grave. She had no obligation to tend in the cold October mornings before he'd come back, before there was any reason to believe he ever would. He thought about what it meant to care for something simply because it deserved caring for, without any expectation of it coming back to you. "It's not wrong," he said. "It's decent." She nodded once, the way she did when something was settled. They stood there until the light was gone and the valley had gone the color of charcoal, and the first stars were showing above the mountains to the east. Neither of them moved to go in for a while, which was its own kind of statement, though neither would have called it that. "There are things the frontier teaches you that you don't learn anywhere else, and one of them is this: that people are mostly what they do when no one is watching. Not what they say they do, not what they believe about themselves, but what they actually do in the ordinary private moments when there's no audience and no record and no reward coming." Evelyn Mercer had weeded a dead man's grave in the October cold because it seemed to her like it should be done, and she'd paid a stranger's debt because she'd once had a stranger pay hers, and she'd kept 2 years of accounts for a property she didn't own in a ledger that said so on the first page. Not because someone would find out, not because there was a future in it, just because she'd looked at a situation and decided what was right and then done it. That was not a small thing. Most people think they would do the same, and most people are wrong about that because the doing is different from the thinking about doing in ways that are easy to underestimate until you're actually standing in the cold with a set of accounts that don't benefit you and a bill you didn't incur. Wyatt knew this because he'd been the recipient of it, and being the recipient of something teaches you its actual size in a way that nothing else quite does. What he couldn't have told you that first morning when he'd knocked on his own door and a stranger had opened it was that the thing he needed most wasn't a lawyer or a winter's supply of feed or a legal resolution to a property dispute. Those were real needs, and they mattered. But underneath all of them was something older and harder: the need to believe that the world had enough basic decency in it to still be worth building toward. That was what 3 years in the mountains and on the slow road home had taken out of him most thoroughly. Not his health, not his money, not even his wife. She'd been gone before any of it started. What it had taken was the quiet working assumption that things could still come right. Evelyn gave that back to him, not by saying it. She was not a woman who said the things she meant when not saying them was an option, but by being the evidence of it. She was the argument made in practice rather than language. He didn't tell her that. He probably wouldn't. They were not people who made speeches at each other, and the truth of it lived fine without being said. Nice. Clara went to Cheyenne the following spring, which was hard on Evelyn in the way that right things are sometimes hard. They put her on the stage at a waypoint 12 miles south, all 4 of them, and Clara hugged her mother for longer than she usually allowed herself to. And then she climbed up into the coach with her bag and her opinions and her particular kind of fearlessness that she'd probably been born with and certainly been raised toward, and the coach went down the road and became small and then was gone. Evelyn didn't cry at the waypoint. She cried once on the ride home, briefly, and then she didn't again. Nora, 15 now and almost as tall as her mother, rode beside her and didn't say anything, which was the right call. Wyatt rode behind them both and looked at the road and the mountains and the October sky and thought that the shape of a family was not a fixed thing. It shifted and grew and lost pieces and found others,
And the grief of the losing didn't cancel out the fact of what was there. He thought about that a lot in the years after. About how much of his life had been organized around loss, around Margaret, around the years in the wilderness, around the long accumulation of things that hadn't worked out, and about how you could spend so much time accounting for what was gone that you missed the inventory of what remained. What remained was this: a ranch in better shape than it had been in years, a herd that was healthy and growing, a water rights registration that was clean on paper and undisputed, fence lines that held, a kitchen garden along the south wall of the house that Nora maintained with a seriousness that the Marigolds probably deserved, and a woman who had walked into his life by way of his own forgotten generosity, who'd kept his house and his land and his dead wife's grave and had asked for none of it back, and who now stood at his fence line in the evenings sometimes, looking out at the valley the way you look at something you've decided belongs to you, not by possession, but by the harder right of having cared for it when it had nothing to offer in return. He asked her to marry him on a plain November morning while they were fixing a section of fence on the north pasture, which was not a romantic setting and was not how either of them had probably imagined such a conversation happening. He'd been meaning to say it for some time, and he kept putting it off because there was always something more urgent, and he kept telling himself he'd find the right moment. And then one morning, the right moment seemed like it was never going to arrive on its own, and he was holding one end of a fence wire and she was holding the other, and he just said it. "I think we should get married," he said. She looked at him across the fence wire, a long, even look. "You think we should," she said. "Yes." "You've been thinking about this for a while," she said. It was not a question. "Since about April," he said. "It's November." "I know." She held his gaze for another moment. Then she looked back down at the fence wire. "Let me finish this section," she said. They finished the section. They walked back toward the house in the November cold with their breath fogging around them, and she was quiet for long enough that he started wondering what the quiet meant. Then she said, "Yes, I think we should." He nodded. They went inside and Nora was at the table doing schoolwork and looked up at them both and then looked back down at her work and said nothing, but she was smiling at the paper in front of her, which she probably thought she was hiding and probably wasn't. They married in December, quietly, in the front room of the house with Nora as witness, and a man named Alderson, who was the nearest thing to an official within reasonable travel distance. Clara sent a letter from Cheyenne that arrived 3 days after, which said she was glad and that it had taken long enough, and that she expected to hear all of it when she came back for the summer. Wyatt framed that letter and put it on the wall of the kitchen, which made Evelyn shake her head, but she didn't take it down. There are things about this story that are easy to summarize and things that aren't, and the things that aren't are the ones that actually matter. The ranch prospered, which is the easy version. The harder version is that it prospered because two people who had learned not to expect much from the world kept deciding, daily, to put in the work anyway, kept getting up before light and doing what needed doing and falling into bed at night and getting up and doing it again. And somewhere in the accumulation of all those ordinary days, something was built that had the quality of permanence, not perfect permanence. Things broke and were repaired. Animals died and were mourned in the private frontier way, which is briefly and without sentiment because there is always something that needs doing next. There were hard winters and dry summers, and at least one year where the margins were close enough that Wyatt spent 3 weeks doing careful, unpleasant arithmetic at the kitchen table. But they came through them. Not gracefully. There's not much grace in the actual doing of things, whatever the stories say, but they came through. What Wyatt understood, eventually, was something he couldn't have understood at the start, that the act he'd performed in Hatcher's Creek all those years ago had not returned to him as payment. It had returned as something larger than payment, which is what happens when you give something without conditions and without record and without the expectation of return. The giving changes its shape over time. It grows into something that has nothing to do with the original transaction anymore, something that belongs to a different category of experience entirely. He had given a stranger her footing when she had none. She had given him his life back when he hadn't believed he had one left. And from that exchange, if you could even call it an exchange, because it had been two separate acts of uncalculated generosity separated by years and distance and grief, from that, something had grown that neither of them had intended, and both of them had built one ordinary day at a time. That was the truth of it, and it wasn't a clean lesson or a simple moral. It was just what happened when people decided to be decent to each other without waiting to know what it would cost them or what they'd get back. The valley below the ranch was still there in the evenings, wide and quiet and going blue-gray in the October light, the mountains behind it holding the last of the sun. Wyatt stood at the fence line sometimes and looked at it the way you look at things you've almost lost and didn't, which is with a particular quality of attention that ordinary looking doesn't have. Evelyn stood beside him sometimes, and sometimes she didn't, and both of those were fine. The cottonwoods in the corner of the yard had grown bigger than he'd realized, the way trees do when you're not watching closely. The grave beneath them was well kept, and would stay that way. Some things end. Some things change into something else. And sometimes if you're stubborn and lucky and have the right person beside you, the thing that changes turns out to be better than what you started with, not because the loss wasn't real, but because what came after was real too, and you found your way to letting it matter. That was enough. On the frontier, on most fronts, that was more